Hey, Whiskey Ringers. I am thrilled to welcome back Impex Beverages as the Whiskey Ring Podcast presenting sponsor. Each month, we'll be talking about a new set of single casks, maybe feature a chosen distillery, or single cask from a chosen distillery. Listen for the mid-roll for more info on this month's offerings. And now, a brand new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Hey, folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today, talking about a country we definitely have not talked about, but you'll know has been on my mind if you've been following me on Instagram or recent reviews. Talking about some whiskey from Germany this time, continental Europe in general, but specifically from Germany. So with me, I've got Mr. Fred Barnet of Anthem Imports, and we're going to be talking all about Eifel Whisky. So Fred, welcome.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
And as you noted before we started recording, you're a listener of the show as well. So you, as I said, the rabbit hole we might go down. You know kind of what you might expect. So cheers to you for being brave and entering the whiskey ring.
I'm a listener. I'm honored to be included. You've had so many great guests, and I've learned so much from the show. And so I really appreciate the invitation.
Awesome. So before we get into Eifel itself, let's just touch on, what's your role as part of Anthem and in relation to Eifel?
Yeah, so I founded Anthem about 5 years ago. I grew up kind of in the wine and spirits business. My father worked for a large distributor. I went to work for a distributor. And at some point, I found some really cool brands for my company, and I'd learned about some of these world whiskeys, starting with Mackmyra in Sweden, and then really went down the rabbit hole and started doing all kinds of research. I've got a master's in research, and just I'm really good at it. And I found all of a sudden it opened my eyes. I'd been a collector of Scotch and really went deep on Scotch, and at some point learned about all these other whiskeys and started just reading about them before I could even get bottles. And then I was able to order some bottles online and get some of those in. And I was really amazed when I first tried it, because I was really into Scotch and found all these single malts from all over the world, and was amazed that none of them tasted anything like anything I had from Scotland, any American single malts, anything really. And they were all unique from each other. I'm talking whiskeys when I first tried these from England and from Sweden, Finland, South Africa, India, I think as well. And I was just really blown away and started doing more and more research. And finding a bunch of really cool brands, some with very, very limited production, some a little bit bigger, certainly none as large as the Scotch brands that we're also familiar with. But it was one day I was having a glass of whiskey from Switzerland and trying to figure out my next move. I know wanted to leave the company I was at and needed a little career change, and was drinking this whiskey from Switzerland, and I thought, oh, this is so good. How come nobody's brought this into the U.S.? And then I said, yeah, let's come up with it. Let's do that. So I ended up probably 3 weeks later quitting my job and starting this company, named it after a favorite son of mine. And the focus is terroir-driven spirits, predominantly whiskey, from really interesting places. Our slogan is great spirits from great places. Nothing is sourced. Nothing is fake. There's nothing wrong with some of those things that come from a lot of these places, but everything we work with are made by real people, typically grown in the local community. We work with a lot of brands that everything's either family owned or it's owned by a small group of friends. And so we're really trying to bring these unique craft spirits into the United States and show the world that there's more than just a few things out there, that there are a lot of really cool whiskey distilleries from places that you never would have thought made whiskey yet. Even you might go to some of these places and ask the local people in the community, and they'd be surprised that there's whiskey next door.
It's really fantastic. And scrolling through your Instagram and through Anthem's Instagram and just doing some basic research on here, number one, it was a little more difficult because I do research before these episodes. But is this your first podcast that you've been on?
I've done a business podcast. It's my first whiskey podcast.
Okay, yeah, it was. So I think I found the business one.
That honor.
Yeah. No, I found the business one, but I was like, occasionally that happens. But I was like, crap, I don't. I got to create.
I'm
something.
Actually amazed that you found me, because I'm a little, say, camera shy. I don't put my name out there at all, really. It's not on any of the website. It's not on anything. And when you reached out and asked to talk to me or Stephan, I was like, this guy's done his research, because my name's really not in too many places. So I guess it is now. Here we are.
Hey, look, I was interested, and I've reached out to every company I'm interested in. So,
thank you.
get so we'll definitely talk more about some of your other brands. I just wanted to mention a couple of them. As you were saying, Macmira is on there. I've never had them before, but I picked up 2 bottles of theirs out in California while I was there because they just looked different. They had a different idea to them. I think one was the AI and one was maybe the intelligence. And so I'm looking forward. I haven't even had a chance to crack those yet, but looking forward to it. Whiskeys from Switzerland or products from Switzerland, Finland. Haven't even heard of these companies, but I'm curious because, for the same reason I was curious in Stauning early on in this podcast journey, when it's from a new place in a new region, a new terroir, a new whatever you want to call it, it's different and it represents something, and that's fun. So, um, so here we are. And while today's focus is going to be on Eifel, certainly you'll be welcome back on for other brands, for other, bring on as many people as you want, because I want to know. And if even if episode gets 10 downloads instead of 1,000, I still want to know. So
Right on.
So, with that, let's jump into, what's Eifel Whisky's story?
Yeah. So the owner of Eifel Whisky, it's a man named Stephan and his wife, Carolyn. And so he has a background as a wine importer in Germany. And so he, through that, has access to a lot of really interesting casks. His wife's family's been distilling for, I want to say, about 400 years now. And so there's certainly a long family history of distilling there. And Stefan ended up retiring from the wine business, but he's a whiskey drinker. He's big on Lafroig, which I know is not necessarily your favorite style of whiskey, but he's really big on Lafroig, and he's really big on some of this other stuff. And what he's really interested in is the barrels, and he believes that can do a lot. We have arguments, me and him. He doesn't believe there's terroir in whiskey, which is funny because I believe his whiskeys are some of the most terroir driven whiskeys that I represent. There's certainly an undertone, whether it's a rye, whether it's a single malt, whether it's he's got triple malt, he's got a wheated whiskey. They all have very similar things that you could point out. So it's kind of funny that he thinks that, but he does run everything through a column still and then through a pot still, and then really puts them in whatever barrels that he has, and he's very proud of his barrels. I've tried to facilitate exchanges between some of the other distilleries and him. No interest there. I've tried to help him out with some cognac or champagne barrels, or no interest there either. He's very particular, but he gets really good barrels. He's done rye whiskey that he's put into freshly emptied German Pinot Noir barrels. The When I say freshly empty, I mean emptied within about 2 hours. So really nice and wet. You bring out a lot of the character there. He's done things with cream sherry, which I haven't seen much of, if at all, in the market. He's got some really, really excellent Grand Cru Class A Bordeaux casks as well. He's almost got like a mini Solera system for the sherry cask that he does, in a way where he has the sherry that he gets, and then he'll put it in the barrels, and then he'll take it out of the barrels and put it into an IBC container, and then stick it into a different barrel when he wants to get that one better. So then the next barrel may have essentially start with sherry that's a couple of more years older. He's all about experimenting though. He's got, I can't remember the number. I want to say it's maybe 186 barrels in his warehouse. When he bottles a barrel, he distills one barrel. It's one in, one out. It's not something he's looking to grow. He's not looking to be the next, Macallan or anything like that. It's very limited production. It's sold in that region of, in the Eifel region of Germany. And to back up a little bit, that's sort of on the west side, west side of Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg kind of area. And his products are sold in little shops in that area, but they're not sold in Berlin or Munich. They're really sold there, and then to me in the United States. So if you want Eifel, you're not going to find it in one of the big cities in Germany. You're really only going to find it in the Eifel region, and then here in the U.S., through our offering.
And to your point, I've seen it now only in, I guess, 3 places. One was an auction site, and that doesn't really count because that could be for anywhere. But that was how I found my first bottle, because I was just like, oh, a German whiskey, 500 ml bottle. Let's take a chance on it. And then
700 ml bottle, right?
No, this was a 500 from 2019. It was called it was called the malty blend or something. I meant to pull it out, but I couldn't find the bottle. It was small.
Yeah, because the 500 mLs are allowed here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Huh.
So it was probably a European auction site. So, but yeah, I found it and I tried it and I was like, ooh, this is this is really different. This is a single malt, but it
Yeah.
doesn't, as you said, doesn't taste like Scotch or
Oh.
whatever that means. But then I had kind of I had looked around for it. I found I couldn't find it at that time. I couldn't find it in the U.S. And then suddenly, when I went to California back in November, we are recording, mid January. I went to California in November, and I happened to visit a Total Wine, and I saw the bottles there. I saw a couple of them, and ended up going to two Total Wines. I found a couple of different bottles for them to try, and I was just like, hell, I mean, they're so reasonably priced at like between 45 and 60 bucks, I think, something like that, like, or not much more than that, you know.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe a little more, but like nothing crazy, you know.
Yeah.
I was like, for that, I'll take a chance on a few bottles. Like, I know one was good, try the other one. And then when I came back to New York, I looked at the one Total Wine that we're allowed to have in New York, and they had one bottle remaining of I think it was of the rye, which I had already, but still, I was glad
Did
to
the rye
see
have
it.
a vintage on there, or was it unmarked?
I think that one was
So the first release
2021.
we did was okay, 2021. Cool.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so in addition to besides the 2019 one, the rest of the ones that I have are all 2021 edition. Um, so I mean, so Stefan, coming from this background of a wine distributor and getting all these barrels and things, yeah, I mean, they stood out as being these really interesting mixes, and we'll talk more about them as we get into the different products. But one I wanted to call out, like you said, was the cream sherry usage. And just I didn't do huge research into this, but the only other one that I could think of immediately that used cream sherry was there was a one-off release from either Deanston or Tobermory. I think Deanston.
Hmm.
That used a cream sherry cut, but that was the only one. Like, no one uses it because it's usually either too sweet or they're using other sherry casks instead. But one of the more interesting things too, again, we'll get more into it, is that in trying these, I actually tried them before knowing all the barrels involved.
Yeah.
And I was like, this tastes very different. Like this, and so there's issues of not issues, but there's questions of terroir and of barreling that go in with the flavor itself. So as we're talking about
We
additions,
wanted to give more.
hey, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I said we wanted to give more information about the barrels and everything on the labels. Um, when you do that here, I know a lot of listeners probably don't know, but the TTB, this agency that we all love, gets to decide whether your label's approved or not. And sometimes they ask for more information. In this case, they ask for what's called a formula approval, which means you have to submit your entire process of how you do everything, and they get to review it and then approve it or not, or ask more questions. And Stefan is the kind of guy that doesn't like to do things like that. Like, he wouldn't come on the show, I guarantee you. He doesn't like to answer certain questions. He doesn't like bureaucrats and all that. And so he just said, we're taking it off there. That's why some of them just say like aged in barrels or whatever. But yeah, he wanted to give the information on there, but felt like he wasn't allowed to without revealing his trade secrets. So which speaks a bit to the quirkiness. On that note too, he distills his own rum in Germany from German sugar beets, only to have a rum cask to age some whiskeys in. So just real unique kind of stuff going on.
Do you know if the rum's any good?
It is good. It is really good. Yeah, a little bit left at a bottle that he sent me in 2018 at the house still.
I'm always curious. It's like, the bodegas that are aging or seasoning casks with sherry, and then they dump the sherry down the drain because the sherry's worthless. It's more for the cask. So just curious if he dumped the rum rather, or if he used it, bottled it,
Oh
opened
no, he'll drink it. When we started working together, he told me so. Originally, it was a set amount of bottles we were allowed to get every year, purchased from him, and he said, "You can take your allocation or not. I don't care. If you don't take it, I'll just drink it or sell it to my friends." And he said, "I don't want to see a depletion report. I don't know where you sell it to. I don't care if you sell it all to one account or if you sell it to hundreds of different accounts." He said, "I don't want to know anything." He's just very, very interesting like that. But I think his personality actually comes through in the whiskeys as well.
Yeah,
Just this weird kind of quirky thing that you wouldn't you wouldn't see everywhere.
Absolutely. So, we're talking about the different years and such. So, the edition 2021 or edition 2019, what's the significance of those years or editions? Is it just simply when it's bottled or dumped?
Yes, correct. It's when it's bottled. And so because he comes from the wine background, I actually come from a bit of a wine background as well. He wanted to do everything that we release as a one-off so that while we release a single malt whiskey every release from Eifel Whiskey, no two of the single malts will be the same. So, if you open a Macallan 12 from that was bottled this year, it's probably going to taste pretty similar to a Macallan 12 from 20 or 30 years ago. Will there be some slight differences? Sure. But I think, it's going to be pretty much the same whiskey. Whereas he might use entirely different barrels. He might give us one year, a rye whiskey that's German Pinot Noir barrels. Another year it's Malaga casks. Another year it could be something completely different. So he wanted to make everything kind of a one-off. So we didn't really have that idea in mind the first year. So the first year we did just single malt and the rye. And then the second year he wanted to do the vintage. So what we were going to do originally was a one-off every year with just one different kind of one-off that's one time only, in addition to the annual release. So that year we did a peated single malt whiskey for 2019, and it was a beautiful, beautiful whiskey. And then we didn't end up taking an allocation in 2020. I had to decide by April 1st, and I felt like maybe it was the right call to hold off on that for a little bit. So we ended up doing that 2021, and then we'll do a 2023 as well because we were able to get quite a bit in 2021. So we will have some stuff coming in this year, and I guess I can announce it here first since this is the first podcast I've done. But we will have a 10-year age statement on Eifel this year on Eifel Whiskey. We'll have a 10-year single malt and a 10-year peated single malt, and then we also are either going to have a 9-year aged statement or 10-year triple malt whiskey, which will be barley, wheat, and rye. And you've seen the scenery on the bottles. I've got a funny one on this too. So I asked him, I said, can you tell me more about the artist that does these? Because for the listeners, you can't see, but if you just, pull it up on the internet, it's the beautiful paintings of the scenery of that region of Germany. And they're gorgeous, and they're all different. Every bottling we've done said something different on there. So I asked him, I said, these are great. Can you tell me more about the artist? And maybe we can get the artist to sign some bottles. He said, no. No. It's not just one artist, it's many artists. The only thing they have in common is that they're all dead. He said, so they've all been dead for 100 years, and that's why I use them. So I don't have to pay them any kind of royalties.
That works. That's fair. I like it.
It works. It's fair. But as a result, I mean, the whiskeys are beautiful inside and out. I think it's something, if you see the bottle on the shelf, you'd be crazy not to just pick it up and look at it and think, huh. And all the coloring you see on everything, it's all natural color. There's no chill filtration, no coloring. Nothing goofy going in there. What you see is what comes right from that barrel.
And what's noticeable too, I mean, the label stands out, but also the shape of the bottle is a little different. It's not your normal wine, either wine bottle or squat like whiskey. Squat. Yeah.
It's interesting. He picked that out himself, and who am I to argue? I think it looks great. It's certainly not something I've seen on anything else out there. So it does help it stand out. And then I mean, I think it looks good. It looks good on a back bar or on a store shelf, which is something a lot of people are not necessarily conscious of when they put their design out there. But yeah, it looks good.
So then, and without the secondary packaging going around it, you just see the bottle on the shelf. So there's nothing hiding it. So again, that's how it caught my eye multiple times. Clearly, jumping back a little bit to the 30,000 foot view, again, this is the first time that we're talking about German distilling and whiskey from Germany or that region, really. I mean, the closest I think we've gotten is probably Denmark, honestly.
Yeah.
So, what does the German distilling scene look like?
Yeah, it's wild. So there are twice as many whiskey distilleries in Germany as there are in Scotland. Sorry, is that right? I've got the numbers at home. Maybe back that up. But I did a presentation at Bar Convent Berlin, and if you look at Germany and France combined, there's twice as many whiskey distilleries in those two countries as Scotland and Ireland. And Germany, I do believe, actually does have twice as many as Scotland. I can verify that when I'm back home. But but yeah, it's quite a scene. Now a lot of these guys are producing a little bit. Like I reached out to some producers based on the research that I'd done, and I've got friends in Europe that'll make recommendations for me. And there were people that were like, we make 300 bottles a year. There, some people make 60 bottles a year. You can't you can't import that. And also a lot of them don't have, the proper licenses anyway. So some of these guys are really small, but there are folks out there that are producing decent volumes that, I mean, they're not looking to challenge the larger brands per se, but I think they are looking to make a dent in it and show that they can produce world-class whiskey. One thing I think, and you've talked about this a bit, but a lot of the barley that is used in Scotch doesn't come from Scotland, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just like there's nothing wrong with sourcing a whiskey, but there's whiskey consumers in Germany and whiskey consumers in France that are they may be farmers and they may be selling their barley to whiskey in Scotland, and they're really of making of drinking whiskey, and they start to think to themselves, maybe I can do this myself, and I could do this in a German way that's not so confined by some of the rules and regulations or just the traditions that they have in Scotland, and it gives them a free hand. And so I think that's something that we're starting to see a lot more of these things come in. And yeah, I mean, there's quite a few distilleries there in Scotland and in Germany now that I think, on a quality standpoint, are really good. I've tried to take a look at Stork Club. Have you tried that one yet?
No.
It's not one of mine, but it's a fantastic German rye whiskey that unfortunately it's not mine, but I'm happy to be a customer of it. It's quite a nice whiskey. It's imported by Price Imports.
Yeah, I'll definitely take a look at it.
And then next door, I mean, I've probably I joke about it, but I've probably had more Austrian whiskey than anybody here in the U.S. We don't actually import any of it right now, but I went to Austria, and I mean, I tasted. There were 50 whiskey distilleries in Austria when I went a couple of years ago, and that's crazy. That's a country with a population of about the Atlanta metro area. There's 50 whiskey distilleries there. We went to a little distillery. I mean, smaller than my bedroom, honestly, and they had 23 casks is all they had. I mean, you think about what some of these guys have. They had 23 barrels. We tasted 15 of them that day, my wife and I, with the owner, and I mean, it was just a unique experience. These tiny little distilleries that we were on the train, and someone was like, where are you guys going? And we told them we're going to a whiskey distillery. So we have whiskey in Austria. It's like, he lived in the same little town. But yeah, this stuff is I believe it's the future of whiskey. I believe that especially as a lot of the larger guys keep taking price increases and they get harder to find, that there's absolutely nothing wrong with the quality of products on these. And with no disrespect to some of our American craft distillers out there, a lot of these guys have a big jump in Europe on what's going on in America. The fact that we can get 9 or 10-year-old Eifel whiskey, when I don't know too many American single malt whiskey distilleries that could put, a 10-year age statement on a single malt whiskey and do it at the price that we're able to do it. So I think that's going to open a lot of eyes to say, I still will prefer my Scotch and drink my Scotch most of the time, but it's okay to try something from somewhere else. Why not?
Yeah, and you're dead on with the American single malt comparison. Like it still is a big passion of mine because I'm still into the scene and learning more about it. But I really had a period like in the end of Q3 and beginning of Q4 of 2022 where like I was focused on the single malt commission, the new regulations coming out. Hopefully, it's bananas that still the comment period's been over for 3 months and we still don't have the regulations out. But the idea of the age statement, I mean, you're right. The only ones that I could think of off the top of my head are guys like McCarthy's and Westland, who have been around for much longer than that, really, like 15 years or so. So they can have stocks that have sat that they didn't have to move just to keep the doors open.
Right.
So with Germany too, there's so many topics that we could touch on. I know we're not going to get to all of them, but we'll get to as many as we can. One of the comparisons I wanted to make was that you mentioned there are these certain number of German whiskey distilleries. If you expand that to like any kind of distillery, you start getting into the clear liquors, schnapps, and different liquors, let's say, let alone the beer scene, which obviously is kind of the calling card of Germany.
Yeah.
How, I guess this is more of a cultural question, but I think because Germany is usually depicted as, it's Oktoberfest all the time kind of thing. Uh, is there a whiskey culture in Germany that we haven't really seen yet or don't quite understand on this side of the Atlantic? And is that also
That's a
dependent on
good
where you
question.
are in Germany?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I can't necessarily speak to that, but I'll say that the generations change, and I think we see a lot of the shift. And maybe your grandparents drank schnapps, and maybe your parents did it occasionally, but maybe you know it may not be your thing. And I think what you're seeing are people that are more accustomed to drinking Scotch or bourbon. And in fact, on that note, to talk about real quick, our Swiss whiskey distillery, they produce what they call a bourbon. Obviously, we couldn't call it bourbon here, but it's a Swiss whiskey made from corn and done just like we would call a bourbon here, but made from Swiss corn. Um, but because they're used to drinking uh, bourbon over there, and so why not? I mean, these countries have great food cultures, and I think if you're making beer and you're already distilling something else, whiskey's kind of like the logical step. In a lot of these countries, though, whiskey distillation wasn't legal, and that was something that in some of these countries came about as late as like 2003 or so. And so a lot of times they weren't legally allowed to make whiskey. They were allowed to distill schnapps and allowed to do this and that, but whiskey was something that wasn't allowed. So Finland is one of the countries we work with that I believe was 2003 was the year. I think Germany around then. Switzerland I know was around too. I'm sure it was something to do with an EU regulation or deregulation. But yeah, the idea is that these guys might have had a history, a culture of drinking whiskey, but weren't even like legally allowed to do it. So there was no industry there. And but that's a good thing. They're able to now make their own traditions. They can look at Scotch and say this is I mean, single malt Scotch is the gold standard of, well, I believe of whiskey in general, but I don't want to get hate mail from the bourbon heads out there. But I mean, single malt Scotch certainly is great, and I think that these guys are all consumers of it. And like I said earlier, they really they believe that now they can go ahead and make world class products themselves. And really, Stephan at Eifel Whisky, he wasn't trying to compete with anyone, or really do anything. He was surprised, very surprised to see an email from an American come through, and I knew a lot about the products because of the research that I had done. It wasn't like he was looking to export to the U.S. Like I said, he genuinely doesn't really care. Um, but
Right.
yeah, you know,
And I mean, that kind of the culture aspect is fascinating me more and more just because as it as the calendar goes, the previous interview to this will be the one with Dr. Mark Lawrence Schrod, who wrote the Global History of Prohibition, Smashing the Liquor Machine. I reversed the titles, so it's Smashing the Liquor Machine is the main title. But part of the questions that we got into were the cultural questions of why certain countries in Europe favored or went into prohibition or at least tried it. Then you have the Gothenburg system in Sweden that kind of grew to other places and other nations. And it's curious to hear that some of these places were not allowed to distill whiskey, at least for quite a long time. And that contrast with what you said about Stephan having this multi-hundred year, I think you said 400-year history of family distillation, so that they would have been able to distill, not necessarily whiskey, of course, but they would have been able to distill for these hundreds of years. And now he's making whiskey instead.
yeah, and actually, I found the numbers we were talking about earlier.
Mm.
So there's 307 active whiskey distilleries in Germany. There's 150 in Scotland. Um, and then third place would be France with 90, and then Austria with 88. So I mean, you see, I mean, and then it's Switzerland, Netherlands, and then Ireland. I mean, that's how far down Ireland is, and they've been building distilleries, pretty fast, to kind of make up for all the ones that they shuttered all those years ago. But I mean, you see
Yeah.
where all the growth is coming from the continent. And so I think we're going to enter a new world of whiskey where, I think it's great that people can now in the US, right, go down the street and in almost any place of any decent size, get distillate or whiskey from the local community. But now we're able to get something that's very exotic too. So we'll have the hyper local and also the exotic. I could in the same night have something from, there's a little distillery, 10 miles from my house that actually does agave, South Carolina, agave spirits. But you could do that and then also have tequila on the same night. They've got whiskey too. They've got a whiskey they do in South Carolina. I could also have, a French or German, or you've got a Tibetan whiskey coming shortly. So
Mm.
there's all kinds of fun stuff out there. I mean, if they make barley and they distill it, why not?
And see, now I'm gonna go down the rabbit hole on my own, doing some research on like why the kind of western half of Germany and the Low Countries and Austria, Switzerland, why kind of that area is the hotbed of distilling and not necessarily, and see what Eastern Europe is doing at the same time. I'm always curious about that, but that's a
I'm not
much
tried
bigger
them. I
topic.
know there's
Yeah.
there's a couple distilleries in Poland. I've tried some Slovenian whiskey we were going to import, and then that got a little strange. But I know there's some in Estonia. But maybe I don't know. I mean, those countries maybe historically drank more vodka or whatever else. It might have been something during the Cold War. They just might not have had access to some of the same imports that this generation in Western Europe was able to drink. I mean, one thing that's interesting about France is that they are the largest consumers of Scotch whiskey in the world and a single malt whiskey. And I don't mean like per capita. I mean they drink more Scotch in France than they do in the United States or China or India, like total. But France is not a country that historically likes imports, right? So they don't import a lot of wine there. They don't really like that. I think as soon as the French really start to culturally realize that they're shipping their barley, that their barley is what's in the Scotch, but that also there's a lot of really cool stuff coming out of France now, and they're able to take, French single malt whiskey and age it in Armagnac casks or champagne or whatever. I mean, just all kinds of very interesting casks from their communities. That I think there's going to be a swing, at least maybe domestically in France, but I think that it's coming here in the United States. I think that's French whiskey and maybe German whiskey are things that we should get more familiar with here because I think it's coming. Um,
Yeah.
and we're not going to be able to stop it. Not that we want to.
Absolutely, and I think that's a perfect segue into the product themselves. As you mentioned earlier, the Scotch distilleries just pulling out Scotch. This goes for other countries as well. Most of the barley that goes into Scotch is not grown in Scotland. It's grown on the mainland, or it's grown in England. A lot comes from Germany, and Central and Western Europe. So when I was tasting through the products, I had that at least in the back of my mind. I didn't have the casks in mind, but I had the source at least in mind. And I was thinking that I wonder, especially when you get to the question of like terroir and kind of macro terroir and micro terroir, because you're because one is used to drinking Scotch whiskey that likely was made from barley already coming from these regions. Would it taste familiar? Would it taste different, uh, but still somewhat familiar? Would it taste completely different? And I kind of ended up somewhere in the middle with that, where like there was a familiarity, like you could tell what the grain was. Uh,
Yes,
Certainly on the single malt, the rye we'll get to, that's a little different, but the
it's
on the
different,
single
right?
malt,
Yeah.
yeah, the single malts felt like you could tell kind of I got kind of a Highland style with it. It was very light, so familiar, but perhaps because of the distillation method, because of what Stephan was doing with the casks, it had enough difference that it wasn't just, oh, this is a Scotch whiskey that is made in Germany, or a German made whiskey in the Scotch tradition. It was different. Like I said, we'll get to the ride later because that one was definitely different. That one
Yeah.
was significantly different. Um, so with the
What I also like is how different they are from each other. Like if you would ever have the chance to taste the 2018 release, which doesn't have the 2018 written on there, but that's the one with no number. The 2018, the 2019, and then the 2021 rise together. You would be so confused because you'd almost swear you're tasting three different grains from three different distilleries. It's just completely different from each other in what he's able to do with these barrels.
yeah, it's and that also, it's funny because he's in doing this with the barrels, but also with the micro distillation. He's touching on a lot of topics very near and dear to me. Like I think 2023 is going to be the year of when American whiskey companies get their finishing act together. Being led by guys like Doc Swinson. I'm a big fan of theirs, so I talk about them all the time.
Yeah.
But they know how to finish a whiskey, especially an American whiskey, correctly. Not over finishing or under finishing or pairing things that don't go together. just for the sake of
Yeah.
doing it.
Or
And
masking those imperfections is something
right,
that a lot of people do.
right. And that's something that I look for in my reviews whenever something is finished or double cast or triple cast. It's always like, can you still taste the distillate? Do you still know what's inside it? What's the base of it? Um, One of the more recent ones was Jack Daniels started putting out their single malt,
I
and
have not tried that yet.
uh, technically neither have I, because they've only put it out in first the as part of the triple mash release that came out at the same time the new bonded release came out, which was just a rebranding in itself, and then the new limited edition release at the end of 2022 was their twice barreled. So it was the single malt, and then it was finished in Oloroso casks.
Hmm.
So the the problem with it was that, one, because no one outside of the company, it's generally speaking, has tasted the single malt by itself. I don't know what the character is. Like, you told me it was
Yeah.
a Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey or even a Jack Daniel's rye finished in the Oloroso, I could figure it out. But because we haven't tasted the single malt on its own, it's like I don't know if it's good or not. And with the twice barreled,
Do
what
you
I
know where
ended
that barley comes from?
no, no idea.
Because that I don't know that Tennessee can grow barley.
They can, but they're not great
Huh.
at it. They
Yeah.
can't grow rye for anything. But they're the problem with the twice barreled was just that, to me at least, I couldn't taste any malt or any whiskey. It just tasted like a higher proof Oloroso. And I was
Yeah.
like, this is great. This is delicious. I love Oloroso, but like, that's not why I bought this. Um,
Right.
I want to know what the single malt is. Supposedly it's coming out this year, starting in travel retail. We'll see. They've changed that a few times, but I'm looking forward to tasting it. And when I do taste it, then I'll go back and say, does that flavor still exist, or is it just still blown out, or covered up like an imperfection, as you said?
Yeah.
Um, so with the we're kind of doing two categories of Eifel's spirits, the rye and the single malt. I know you mentioned earlier they also have the wheated whiskey, um, and and we'll also talk about the peated versions as well. And it feels weird to say versions because you said it's every year is a little different, so it might not be like the rye from every year, the single malt from every year.
Everything is I mean,
Everything's one off. Yeah,
everything's a one-off, but it's also, I mean, because it's special and it's never coming back. I mean, I'm sure to buy a couple extra bottles when I see them out there, because if I like one and then the bottle goes away, I want to know in 10 years, like I can go back and open that other bottle up.
sure, absolutely.
So yeah.
And with the bottle, it's got um, what I love, either screw tops or synthetic corks, because they don't leak, they don't
Yep.
deteriorate. Although what I am curious what a Jack Daniel's Coy Hill would do to a synthetic cork,
Huh.
because they used for that bottle they used a regular cork, but they also had to redesign the bottle and warn people that unless it is in your hand and you are pouring it, you must keep it upright because the alcohol will just burn through the cork.
Oh, well, yeah.
Because I mean, we're
Okay.
talking like some of them were at
I hope they tell their
155 proof.
distributors that, and retailers too, because you see how this stuff gets stored. It's not necessarily pretty.
Yeah, and they, I'm sure some cracked, and because they went up to 155 proof.
Yeah.
So, um, anyway, so the tangent on that, but so with the two styles that we're talking about today, the rye and the single malt, both undergo the same distillation process you mentioned earlier, starting with starting with the column rather, and then moving over to a pot still. The column, I wanted to note, is distilled on grain, on the grist. I think it was put, which not always the case. Usually with Scotch in particular, it's the wort is filtered out before it goes into the column, so you get a little bit lighter. You might not get as many of the toasty flavors. To your knowledge, is that also just part of the German tradition to distill more like on grain as opposed to filtering it?
And I don't know if it's the German tradition, but certainly in this area of Germany, that's what I was led to believe, that that's how it goes. And then it's even before that, I mean, they ferment for 72 to 96 hours. So nice solid, nice long fermentation time.
And because I mean, these questions are coming, so I might as well throw them at you. Do you know if they're using like a wild yeast, what their own? Because the wine guy also, Stephan might have his own yeast. You never know.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was a wine importer, so I mean, he was never a winemaker, or at least as far as I know.
Hmm.
But no, I'm not so sure on what strain of yeast they use. He's the kind of person that would tell you that it's not important, but he might even believe that it is important. I mean, we certainly know it's important. But he really like his argument is that it's coming from the barrels, and then I finally did get him to admit that there was some terroir in whiskey, but his the way I got him to admit it, right, was that I said if you took one of your barrels and sent it to Isla for 6 years and just let it age at Ardbeg, would it not taste different than how it tastes now? He's like, well, I guess in that sense, terroir does matter. So, I mean, it is though, the climate, and, the barrel, I mean, it is almost a living, breathing thing. The barrel is breathing in and taking on, the land itself. And I think that's really, he's more interested in that and the barrels themselves than the distillation process itself. I mean, they used some of the locally grown grain, but him and his distiller, they're just like it doesn't necessarily matter. They don't believe that it matters, but they use it anyway. They're like, yeah, if the prices went up locally, we just switch. It wouldn't make no one would know any difference, but they still use it, so they have to be believing that there's some value in that. It's a strange one.
Yeah, and so you go through the primary distillation column on the grist, go into a second smaller copper pot still, proof it down to 120 proof, entry proof, and then goes into whatever barrel he's chosen for it to go into.
Yes. And it's really how he feels. Like they distill on Tuesday and Friday when they're distilling, and they'll barrel what they distill on Tuesday on Friday, and then they'll distill on Friday and they'll barrel that on Tuesday. And then when they've finished up however many barrels they want to do, they're done for a while. Then he goes and lives in his vacation house, and he lives in Spain most of the year. So they'll go down there and do that. But yeah, it's kind of just it's what he feels like. He really treats it more like an artist would. So it's like I want to try these Malaga casks. I want to try PX Sherry. But then he might get this wild idea of like, let's blend the PX Sherry ones with the Malaga cask and see what that does. Or we'll do this rum cask finish with this. And I've not had anything from him that I've been disappointed in at all. He's even made some brandies that are quite fantastic. I just don't think the U.S. market's ready for $70 German brandy just yet.
Yeah, I'm hoping it gets there in a couple of years. I'm scheduling with Copper and Kings right now, so
Oh,
brandy's
cool.
on my
Great
mind.
stuff. Yeah.
I'm also just a big fan of brandy. I mean, I'm a New Yorker, so we're used to Applejack and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So with this particular single malt, I can't believe I left the bottle outside. With this particular, but I have my notes, which are important. So for this edition of the single malt, the 2021, we just went through the distillation process, and then it's aged 4 years in an ex Bordeaux cask that was made for American oak,
Right.
and then another 4 years in first and second fill cream sherry casks.
Yep. And yeah, and he's really particular about his cast. Like I'll tell you, if he doesn't like the cast when they come up, like he'll rechar them. He makes sure his sherry, the sherry that goes in those casts is all good. It's very much as I say he's like an artist. He takes the craft very seriously, and he like none of these barrels came from anywhere that wasn't really good and done in the right way. He's gotten barrels that he didn't like, and he just changes his mind on what he's going to distill, and he will not use a barrel that he doesn't think is perfect for the project.
And obviously, these are not all coming from Germany. And if it's Bordeaux cask, then it's coming from France.
Yep.
Cream sherry, I think. I mean, there must be multiple places making cream sherry. I don't think that's geographically designated.
Well, I think he gets it all from Spain. He works with these barrel brokers that help him, and he gets it from Spain.
Well,
So yeah,
if he lives there
he's
most
got
of the
it.
year.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, here we do that, but I don't know that in Europe they're drinking Taylor or whatever.
True. But yeah, I mean, if he's living in Spain most of the year, he's probably got access to, I'll pop over to this bodega today, and or maybe this other one tomorrow, see, how the sherry is, and
Yeah.
so I could see them do that.
He'll send me pictures of him like tasting with like tasting some sherry, and then reference to this maybe in some Eiffel that you buy in 5 years or something like that.
That's I love it. The artistry
Yeah.
of it. I really do believe there's an artistry to cask management and using casks,
Hmm.
whether it's finishing or the full maturation process. And in this case, it's the full maturation process.
Yeah.
No,
There's nothing worse than tasting a whiskey when you're like that's finished in something and you think these both would have been better away from each other. Like this made
mhm.
both of these things worse. This made this barrel worse, and this made the spirit worse. It's always better when you can enhance and really marry the stuff together. And that's what's interesting. He's not finishing, right? He's aging it for 4 years and then he's aging it for 4 years in a different cask. It's not 4 years and then like 3 months in another cask. It gives it time to settle and it gives it time to grow. And frankly, he's had some stuff that he thought would be like excellent when he did the second thing. And then he'll just well, okay, let's see what this. Okay, we'll do some math on this, and he'll put it into a third cast, and I'll be damned, it comes out perfect. So
Yeah.
that's
Of the
that's always an option.
yeah, I mean, of the ones that I have noted down, like nothing is under like a 2 year age period for a cask. I think the lowest one I have is the rye. It's got 2 years in the ex Bordeaux, and then two in second film Lager, and then another year in at least in the German Pinot Noir. But that's like the smallest age period that I can see. It's all like I said, it's not just throwing it in a barrel for a few months. It's all longer term.
Yeah, and even with that, we decided that after this 21 release, we're going to take the rye. We're not going to bring in a rye this release. We wanted to age a little bit more and enhance it. Now, I'm not one of those people that's addicted to the age and thinks that I don't like the age question. I don't really want age statements on the whiskey, but he is proud to have a 10-year-old whiskey. When people ask me how old it is, my first response is don't worry about it because like our first year, the Eifel German rye release is one of the best releases that we've ever done. I'm very proud of it. And it was aged 4 years, and everybody that tasted it would swear it was 10 years old. So what does it matter? If I tell you it's 4 years, you might not want it. But I mean, and I know that 4 years in Germany is different than 4 years in Kentucky. It's not going to be the same. So but yeah, I mean, yeah, the youngest thing that he's put out for this release was 4 years, and like I said, this next release it'll be 9 or 10 years.
Yeah, I mean the single malt's getting on this particular one was 8 to 9 year blend, distilled in
Mhm.
2012 and 2013. The rye was a minimum 5 years, so let's say 5 plus. And if you go by the general rule of like $10 a year kind of thing that you usually
Huh.
see in Scotland when it's not Macallan, um, when it's twice that. Uh, these again, I look at the whiskey and I say these are, at minimum, very fairly priced, and if not better,
Yeah, the
right?
single malt and rye should be retailing for about $80 in the market. Total one, maybe a couple dollars less in some markets, but not all markets. And then the extra special ones, the peated duo malt and the peated rye cask, those should be about $90 retail.
Yeah, I could be. I'm probably misremembering the amounts just because I just misremember dollar signs
It
sometimes. So,
happens.
but the only thing I could say is I know they can't sell them for below MSRP,
Yeah,
no, sorry, they can't
well,
sell it
not
for
much
below
more.
what they bought it for.
Yeah,
They can't sell it at a loss. So, it can't be much less than that. But even so an 8 to 9 year old whiskey, single malt, $80 to $90
yep.
fits perfectly. Even
That's
a 5 year rye at $80. All right, I mean it's a 5 year rye, but it's had multiple years. It's imported, so it's going to be a little bit more. Uh, still within range.
exactly. I mean, you look at what Whistlepig's getting for some of their stuff, or I mean, if you just look this Eiffel, the Pita Duo malt, and I know maybe we're jumping ahead, but it's a very, very, very well made whiskey. It's incredible. Johnny McCormick at Whiskey Advocate compared it to a blended Scotch that he said cost 10 times the price. So he compared it to a $900 blended Scotch. I think if you were to put the word Ardbeg on the side of that, you would easily command several $100. Um, just and I think it's as good as any of the Ardbegs, and it's one of my favorite distilleries. So
Yeah.
we're very proud of these releases. They're very, very well made, and they've been really well received. People, I've not tasted any of these with anyone who said that they didn't enjoy them. They may prefer one of the expressions over the other, or they may not like one of the expressions. But I've never had anyone just taste them and be like, "Yeah, I don't like this stuff. Get this weird whiskey out of my face."
No, for sure. And I've given plenty of whiskeys like that to my friends who like I like it, and but they'll be like, "What the hell is this thing?" Um, no, the duo malt peated was very very good, and you pointed out earlier, Lefroy's not quite my cup of tea, um, but I do like other peated stuff, that different peat types, like the Kalilas, like the Highland Park, especially Stauning, love their kind of peat.
Yeah,
So
that's
I
good.
tend more to the heather and the slightly less maritime, with the exception of
Have you
Highland
got
Park.
into Springbank yet?
Uh, a little bit, not too much. So I won't say
It's a good one.
how I totally feel on that, but that's also got the
Okay.
Campbelltown funk.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm okay with funkiness, and I love funk and rye, like sorry, not rye, rum.
Rum. Yeah.
A good Jamaican rum from I've got Clarendon and Long Pond, uh, right now that
Hamden.
I'm in Hamden, I'm loving on. So not opposed to it. I have had ones that were, and from Raj actually, um, that were from, I want to say Long Pond, but they're under the brand Money Musk
Hmm.
and Rest and Be Thankful. And those were some of that. It was just so funky. I just I couldn't get through it. It was too
Too
much.
much.
It was like 25 years of funk.
Oh well, I haven't gone
So
down that path
yeah, it starts getting into like the end of the Thriller video where it's like,
yet.
the funk of 40,000 years, and it's kind of what it tastes like. Um, so with anyway, getting back to Eiffel, I go on tangents. It happens.
Hey, that'll happen.
Um, so I wanted to we touched on the single malt and we touched on the single malt, a little bit on the rye, but we'll come back to that. The duo malt peated whiskey. I should note there's also a peated rye. Um, but we're going to focus more on the kind of quote unquote regular rye. But for the duo malt peated whiskey, so this is just rattling off some stats that'll be in the reviews and in the tasting notes. It's a 4-to-1 ratio of malted wheat and barley. So 40% unpeated malted barley, 40% unpeated wheat, and then 20% heavily peated malted barley that's peated to a 35 ppm. It's a minimum 7 years old. The non-peated malts are aged in first fill red Bordeaux casks, American oak, and the peated in, as you were alluding to one of these casks earlier, the refurbished and recharred red wine casks with new heavily charred German oak bottoms. So a lot of
A lot of
stats
stuff
there.
going on.
So just within this, it is it's one of those whiskeys that I think is easily already one of my kind of top of the year contenders. It's interesting, it's so complex, and it's also doing all of this at 46% ABV, which I mean I'm a proof whore, and
Yes, you
I'm
are.
very happy drinking this. So the questions that come out of this are, number one, you alluded to your answer before we started recording, but I do have to ask, where the peat might come from, or the peat profile.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure where it comes from. That's something that I honestly just need to double check my notes and figure that out. It's something that's just escaped me. No one has asked me in the past few years, and I guess it just fell out of my head. So I do need to ask him about that. I'm guessing it came from Scotland, but I don't know. Yeah, I will ask him.
The peat's everywhere. It's
It is.
basically, unless you're in tropical or where it's frozen, it's everywhere else. So,
Yep. But a lot of
um,
countries won't let you harvest it, and that's
mhm.
that's one of those things too. So we've got a Swiss whiskey coming in, and they have the only permit in, I guess, in the country to get their own to get peat from this one peat bog that they use. So we'll have a, Swiss peated whiskey, but anything else coming from Switzerland, from what I've been told, has to buy it from Scotland. So
And,
go
but
figure.
I bet that peat from Switzerland, like there's got to be something very unique about that peat
Yeah, it's
flavor.
volcanic. It's crazy. It's unlike
Yeah.
anything. I mean, it tastes like it's just like it's volcanic. It's so different.
Yeah. Like I joked, I think I mentioned this on a previous podcast. I'm not sure it's coming out yet by the time, as of recording, but I had spoken to the guys at Mammoth, and I got some samples afterwards. And one of them was a peated single malt that they make, and it was peat from Lake Michigan.
Oh,
So like I'd never had unsalted peat, if you will. you know, I never had freshwater peat uh, that I know of, and it was just so it was so weird and so vegetal. I just couldn't get through. It wasn't my thing, and they were like, "That's fine." They know not everyone's going to like everything,
yeah,
but the
it can
important
be
thing is to
polarizing.
yeah, the important thing is to try it at least and figure out what you like. But
See,
I
I
still
started
appreciate
with peat.
getting it.
So like the first whiskey, the first scotch I ever tried, well, at like when I was at a sales meeting was Kalela. It was a signatory independent bottling.
Mhm.
And then I went from there and I bought a bottle of Lagavulin 16. And then I went into Ardbeg and Lafroig and then didn't like Lafroig. So I kind of switched into the Highlands there. And I've actually only now, like years, 7, 8 years later, started to get back. I'm like sipping on the same bottle of Lafroig that I bought in like 2014 or 2015, because I'm finally starting to like it. But I started with peat and then I went to Highlands, which is sort of the opposite of how most people get into Scotch. But yeah, it can be very polarizing. This one though is really balanced. The Eiffel Duo Malt. I found it to be really creamy. I thought it tastes like, in a way, it tastes like Twix. It just this like caramely chocolate. I think it's incredible. I'm actually going to go buy a case of it next time I get to an account that has it. I'm not even kidding, because we only did 200 cases of this for the country, and when it's gone, like I said, it's gone. Um, and so yeah, I'm gonna have some that we have at the house. I bought a bottle last time I was in Georgia, and we ended up our family we drank it over Thanksgiving. It paired really nicely with everything we were doing. So there's a little bit left in that bottle, but I need some for myself.
It's a brand new year, the perfect time for a new whiskey experience. This January, my new experience is at Lochlee Distillery. Sitting on the lowland coast of Scotland, Lochlee is a relatively new distillery with some iconic names behind it. Set up by Malcolm Rennie and now overseen by John Campbell, Lochlee sits on a farm once tilled by the patron saint of everything Scottish himself, Robert Burns. Lochlee's first release, the Sowing Edition First Crop, was one of my top new whiskies of 2022 and one of the best first releases of the year. At the end of 2022, I picked up the newer Our Barley and Harvest Edition releases in advance of my own interview with John Campbell, and both were worthy follow-ups. Each built on the clean, barley-forward, and mildly lowland style of the Sowing Edition by layering in multiple cask finishes. Each comes in a patterned glass bottle, evoking the barley where all of this starts. Keep an eye out for early 2023. Their Fallow Edition is set to hit shelves in Q1, and I, for one, can't wait. The third in the annual series of limited seasonal bottlings, Lochlee Fallow Edition First Crop reflects the season of autumn on the farm, when the fields are left fallow to rest after a busy harvest. This will be the first Lochlee release to be matured solely in 100% first fill Oloroso sherry butts. As always, it is non-chill filtered with no coloring. It comes with a beautiful lavender label to match the rich colors of the previous seasonal bottlings. A big thank you to Impex Beverages for being the Whiskey Ring podcast presenting sponsor, and cheers to you all in a new year. Hey, Whiskey Ringers. I hope you've been taking advantage of that podcast-only code for the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society. They've got around 20 bottlings coming out each month, and there's never a shortage of new things to explore. For the holiday season, December, January, we've got even more bottles than usual available to try and available to buy. If you are a US-based listener, there are at least 12 casks just for this month's release, plus additional ones coming out. If you are a UK listener or an EU listener, there are over 30, a ridiculous number of bottles that you can try and get your hands on. Remember to use code WRP at checkout to get 25% off your annual membership. Now, I noted that on both the peated rye and the dual malt peated whiskey, the dark chocolate, so much chocolate came through, and it was that's why I was trying to kind of identify the peated to try to give a reference point. Like for me, it was similar, most similar at least to a Highland style peat. I'm thinking like a Ben Riach kind of peat, something like
Okay.
that. Subtle, more smoky, a little bit of ashy. No maritime, no
No,
rubber or iodine or anything like
no
that.
brine, nothing like
No
that.
brine, a little vegetal, but again, just so much chocolate. And you start getting those roasted components to it, and the compounds. It's not necessarily what you think of as chocolate, but it ends up registering the brain as a similar compound. And I mean, I loved it. It added when you put malt and chocolate together, it's a beautiful pairing.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And I mean that to me is the house style. Like, everything that I've tasted from him, even the brandies, even the rums, they have this underlying chocolatey kind of note to them. Yeah, the first Eifel whiskey, the rye one that he did, it was like I told people it was a breakfast rye, right? It was oatmeal, it was maple, it was cinnamon, it was chocolate, it was a little vanilla. I mean, it's just everything you'd want if you're drinking whiskey at 7:30 in the morning. Um, which I don't live by.
Hey, look, the so again, quick side note because we always reference other episodes. The previous episode with Mark Schrod. If you listen to this episode after listening to that one, you'll note that you know the image of Carrie Nation in Prohibition times, smashing up saloons and all of that stuff with a hatchet wasn't being done in happy hour. It was being done at 7:30 in the morning because people were still drunk and drinking there from the night before. So,
That'll happen.
yep. So that's really how it happened there. So with the so putting aside the peat, we'll come back to that, and I'm happy to either insert something into the episode or just add it in the tasting notes, of course, as to where the peat comes from. There's also questions of, I think, the flavor profile of a red Bordeaux cask will kind of understand. Like there's enough. I think I've tasted enough things to kind of understand where the certain fruits that come out of there, also some chocolatey notes and roasted notes from the toasting process in the barrel. But those, I was really fascinated by those heavily charred oak bottoms.
Yeah.
Sorry, heavily charred German oak bottoms.
German oak bottoms, yeah.
Yeah. And so we've talked a lot about on the podcast about different types of oak and like French oak, American oak. Um, just did a piece on Doc Swinson's French toasted oak from the Troncaise forest. And I'm curious what is German oak? What does that do?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And on these casts, sometimes he'll do things like when the reason that it may not say that it just says refurbished and recharged recharged red wine cast is because he's not necessarily just using the Bordeaux cast. He may be using he's done alternating before, so he might do a stave of Bordeaux and a stave of German Pinot Noir, and kind of rotate that around and then throw in the German oak barrel. So with all that going on, I can't necessarily say what that's adding and what it's not, at all. I just I he's a mad scientist. Is kind of all I can say is that he's throws a bunch of shit in a cauldron and and it comes out nicely. Uh, I'm not sure that he necessarily knows what heavily charring the German, oak bottoms would do versus, doing it with, an ex bourbon barrel or whatever. But he's willing to try it and then see how it comes out. I don't know what is adding what in this whiskey per se. I just know that it really comes together beautifully. Um, yeah, I don't know the specifics on that. I'd love to go there and watch him distill. I've not had the chance to do that yet, but
It
just to
must be
see,
fascinating. Yeah.
yeah, I would think so.
There's I mean I'm projecting an image, but I can kind of imagine him like he's looking at a distillate. He kind of knows what the distillate's going to be because, as you've said, the focus for Stephan is really on the cask,
Yes.
and not so much on the distillate. So, like he knows what the distillate's going to be, whether it's peated, unpeated, rye blend. He knows what that's going to be. But tasting, that day's distillate and thinking to himself, like you can see the wheels turning and being like, this has a little more or maybe it has a little less toasty character, so they'll want to pair it with a barrel that will add more to that. Or there's not a lot of smoke here, but I want to add a smoky element, so let's put a heavily charred um you know head on the barrel, so it's not going to have a ton of surface area contact with it, but it'll have enough that you'll get some barrel char, some brand new barrel char in there.
Yeah.
And yeah, when you get to do that, love to know just what it looks like, because it like I said, I'm imagining that mad scientist, but a very quiet one, where
Yeah.
everything's in his head, and suddenly he's just like, all right, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. So, um, I love it. I'm fascinated. The so I, before we just in the last like 25 minutes we have, so I want to definitely talk about that rye though.
Oh, the peated
So
rye.
the peated rye and the regular unpeated rye.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So so the peated rye, I do not have the
That the
barrel.
one I mailed you?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So I've got
Yeah.
that. Um and I don't have the barrel info on that one.
Oh, well, that's a fun one. So, what they did was, so it's aged for a minimum of 7 years. And what they did was they took two different things of their selections and they blended them together. The first half was aged for a minimum of 3 years in refill red Bordeaux cask, ex-American oak, and then another further 4 years in first fill freshly emptied Lafroig full-size 10-year casks. Um, Lafroig usually when they sell the casks, from what I've been told, they sell the quarter cask ones. He's got the connections. He was able to get a recently emptied full size tenure, and those casks themselves, just so you know or your listeners know, are ex Maker's Mark. So you've got a lot going on there. Then the other half of the whiskey is aged 4 to 5 plus years in first fill emptied, freshly emptied Lafroig 10, same kind of cask, ex Maker's Mark, and then they finish it for at least a couple years in first fill refill Bordeaux cask from Chateau Assan. It's one of only four wines in the Saint Emilion to hold the top classification of the Premier Grand Cru Class AA. So top notch wines. I mean, these are wines that go for a couple $1,000s a bottle, and he got the barrels and put them in there. What's interestingly is I tasted a version of the second half of this. So just the Lafroig and then the Chateau Assan cask at cask proof at 57% with I had the fortune of tasting with a whiskey advocate writer in Nashville in 2019. And he was going completely crazy for this. He kept telling me it was one of the best whiskeys he'd ever had in his life. He was like, if I was scoring this for the magazine, I'd give it a solid 95. I've only given, a 97 once in my life. This is one of the best whiskeys ever. Well, we ended up, he ended up needing to blend it, and then with the other one of these, but it produced what is an absolutely incredible whiskey. So the rye itself is not peated; it's a peated cask rye whiskey, but it has a lot of notes that you would get from it just because it spent a good bit of time in that Maker's Mark. I guess those two, sorry, Lafroig casks, which are ex Maker's Mark too, but really a lot going on this.
And that's a super important distinction to make, that the rye itself is not peated. All the
Correct.
peat flavor, the smoke, and everything is coming from the casks themselves.
Yep.
And so you mentioned you got to taste the second half of that. Did you get to taste the first half at any point?
You know what? I probably did. So what he did was he sent me over a bunch of things. The one that it's funny because the one that was the second half, he called it Islay, like Eilay, because it's Eifel and Islay combined.
Mhm.
That's what he called it there. And he sent me a little, I want to say like 300 ml bottle that I've still got, a good bit of it in there from a few years ago. But it's fantastic. But he just, frankly, they didn't have enough to do it. If we did it at that proof, he likes to do everything he sells to the U.S. market at 92%, or sorry, 92 proof. And is it worth arguing? I don't know. The whiskeys came out beautiful. I'm actually not big on proof. Uh, maybe you need it in bourbon, but I don't. That's not a shot at bourbon, but maybe you need it in bourbon, and I don't know that you necessarily need it on rye or on a single malt whiskey in general if it's well made. And I think 46 is good. They did taste quite nice at 57. I'm not gonna lie, but yeah, it's still incredible. But yeah, we're probably not gonna get anything that isn't 92 proof from Eifel anytime in the future, or at least anytime soon.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I mean,
No single
92
barrels,
is.
no. I try. He won't do a single barrel for
Yeah. I mean, the 92 is a good proof anyway, just because you don't have to chill filter at that point, and you're still not going to get flocculation unless you get really really cold.
me. Yeah,
So
yeah.
you're safe from that at least. And I still felt like everything drank at or above proof, especially with mouthfeel. And
Mhm.
again, I agree with you too that I think at least that bourbon needs a higher proof because
Yeah.
below really 100, frankly, but certainly below 90, it just feels thin, way too thin.
Yeah.
Uh, so it needs something, and then it also can't stand up to finishing if it's at that proof. That's a different issue. But the heat,
Yeah.
but the reason too I was asking about if you've tried both was that if I wrote this down correctly, the first half was finished first in the wine cask and then in the Lefroy, and the second half was reversed. It was finished in the Lefroy first and then in that exclusive wine cask.
Yeah. What happened was, yeah, yeah, that's right. That's what he did. So you kind of get both that way. Um, I think he felt like what happened was this is what happened. It was after 1 year in the Chateau Hassan barrels, it was great, but after the second year, he felt like it started to go down a little bit in a way that he felt would be repaired by blending it with that first half. So this is not taking one of the imperfections and masking it, more of trying to take that note and bring back what we had in it previously, if that makes sense. But it worked really well. But yeah, he felt like that last year might have taken something away. So, if he does it again, I don't know if he still has access to those casks, but if he does it again, he may do one less year on that, try to finish it. And who knows, a rum cask or German agave spirit or whatever else they got going on over there.
I'd be curious to see an experiment of doing kind of a side by side of
Yeah.
you have to remove a lot of the variables, but let's say you took the rye, just picking a grain, took the rye and said, all right, I'm going to take half of this. The first half I'm going to finish first in Lefroy and then in X Red Bordeaux. And then the other half, I'm going to do the reverse, do the first couple of years in the Red Bordeaux, same amount of time, and then go into the Lefroy and see, what impact does
Yeah.
doing peat first or second have on it? Like, and what is the fact that it's matured for a couple of years and then goes into the second one have on the interactions? Um,
Yeah, it would be great to see all kinds of things like that. I thought it would be interesting if he would take two things done the exact same way. It doesn't matter what it is, same barrels done at the same time, and take one of those barrels down to Spain with him, and then see what that tastes like after a couple years in Spain versus Germany, but the same distillate, the same barrels done at the same time. Because that could be wild just to do those kind of experiments.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the it's another episode I think that came out. Yeah, it came out today. We were talking to Traverse City, Michigan,
Oh, yes.
and we were talking about how they started out sourcing from MGP, as you said, a lot of people do,
Yeah.
um, but sourcing aged product, and then over the years they've then sourced distillate, like new make distillate, and then aged it fully in Michigan instead. And of course, those two things tasted very different because you're aging
Mhm.
it in different places. So yeah, the Germany versus Spain, and then different areas of Spain could be really fun. And I think I skipped over this question, which I can't believe I did, which is in that Eifel region, what does the climate look like?
Yeah, it's a volcanic region. They've got it's a mountainous area. There's a bunch of just active volcanoes there. I've not been, so I can't actually tell you what it feels like there. But yeah, it's a mountainous volcanic region, and he talks about that a lot. But he swears it doesn't matter. But you and I know it does. So
That
that's
yeah,
yeah,
there are some things you can kind of push off with terroir, but volcanic soil,
yeah.
that that's
I mean,
going to
you can
be the
taste it. There's something, there's something tying all these together, and it doesn't matter whether it's a German Pinot Noir cask, whether it's a sherry cask, a Malaga cask, anything that he's used, um, you're going to get some of these notes that are very similar across the board. And with that column still that's stripping it and then doing it through the pot still, you're getting the barrel and you're getting the terroir, and that's typically what you're getting. You're not, you know, frankly, if you strip it, I mean, you've stripped a lot of the flavors from it, but you're getting them back again from the land and the air and the barrel.
and you lose less of it by being able to distill on the grain as opposed to filtering at first. So
Mhm.
it makes a difference.
Yeah,
You can see that as we go back to the bottle design and the label design, the artwork, you can clearly see it's hilly, it's mountainous, um, kind of gravelly, if you will.
yep,
So it's in the artwork, it's inherent in the environment. So Fred, there's so many other things that we could go into here, but the last question that I want to throw to you is do we know where the rye is coming from?
Yes, so the rye is actually coming from the Eifel region. So the way that Stefan explained it to me was that historically that region of Germany, the Eifel region, was too cold to grow wheat,
Mm.
and so they grew barley there. It was a very poor region, and they called it they called it like precious Siberia or something. Like it was Germany's version of just freezing cold, and they couldn't grow anything there, and they were too poor to go buy a grain from anywhere else. So rye is what they would use for their bread and whatnot there.
I mean,
And the barley is coming just from the EU in general.
the rye is one of those grains that I think is one is having its renaissance for
Yeah.
sure. Um, but it for me at least, it might be the grain that conveys terroir the most. I might make an exception for the single malt, farm by farm kind of stuff that Waterford is doing, but
Yeah, that stuff's cool.
it is right. I have a
Yeah.
couple I got to review, but but other than that, the rye, because rye especially is coming from all these regions around the world, particularly northern regions that have this distillation history that could grow rye when they couldn't grow wheat or they couldn't grow corn. Um, so they had to do rye and barley, these hardy crops. So that the first time I tasted Stauning's rye, totally different.
Yeah.
Tasting different varietals from the U.S. grown in different states, totally different. The Rosens, the Dankos, the all the different types. And this too was again. Oh, also I should mention the pumpernickel rye from Middle West Spirits,
I have not
because
tried that yet.
I got to try the pumpernickel rye, but also I got to try the new make of it, at my favorite 138.7 proof. But it just doesn't it I tried that new make and I tried Rosen Rye new make at Stolen Wolf in Pennsylvania, and that was at I think 131 off the still, and neither of them tasted anything like the rye that we've been trained to think it
Yeah.
tastes
I have to caution customers. I've learned over the years that first thing I do, I warn them, this isn't what you're going to think. It's not whistle pig, right? It's
like.
not,
Right.
it's not spicy. It's not going to burn you. It's really more soft. It's more delicate. It's more, I don't want to say this because it may come out, it's more perfumey, and I don't mean that in like a bad way, but it's just, it's not going to be this spicy. It's not whistle pig. It's not it's not a lot of these, ryes that I love here in the US, but, and I know that's Canadian, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, it's a lot. It's not like the ryes that we've been, told to love here. And that's okay. That's the terroir of it. It's going to taste different everywhere. I love the fact that, as much as I love, these Highland scotches, that the stuff we've got in Germany, the stuff I've tried from Austria or Switzerland or South Africa is going to all taste radically different, and it should, right? I mean, the land is different, the people are different, the cultures are different. They're going to want to, at the end of the day, they're going to want to pair it with different food, and different experiences, and so it should taste different. It would almost be worse if it tasted the same. What's
Absolutely.
what's the fun in that?
Absolutely. And yeah, it was very, I found it very subtle, for a while, like for even across different regions, and kind of just runs counter to what I just said. But there is kind of an expectation of rye that it's going to be spicier as a grain.
Mhm.
It's going to have more of those glycols and more of the oh, I just went right out of my head, the black pepper note. But it's going to have the spice that's going to hit you on the front of the tongue and then might warm the rest of it. And this had a little bit of that, but it was much more of this warming feeling. It felt like a cross between a malt and a rye.
Yeah,
And and I know there is 10%, it's 90% rye, 10% malt, but it felt like the rye itself was just rounded and softer and creamier. And it was, again, it was noticeably different. It was a very
it
different
really
rye.
is.
And
It is something you could enjoy in the morning. I mean, not
yeah,
not to bring that joke back, but I mean, it honestly is something that you can enjoy with or without like a little bit of food. It's not gonna overtake your palate, and and like some of these spicy ryes are, where it's almost like in a way drinking something very peated, in that you really don't want to taste anything after that. I mean,
Mhm.
try a extra spicy rye and then try to go back to something soft bourbon or something.
Right.
It's just not going to work.
Yeah, like
So yeah,
tasting it after like a Monongahela style rye or something, like you would just
yeah.
blow the palate out of the
What,
water. But
which of these was your favorite of the Eifel whiskeys that you tried?
ooh, um, I'm going. I keep going between the regular single malt and the duo peated.
You can't go wrong. But yeah,
Yeah,
I love that duo peated.
yeah. There's something very. I keep using the word unique, but there's just something different about the duo peated that's
It's got a lot of
yeah.
structure. It's
That's the
so
thing.
well
It's
structured, and I mean,
yeah,
really like compared with everything we ate at Thanksgiving, but also it was damn good on its own.
yeah,
And
yeah,
yeah, I mean, it's not maybe not high enough proof for you, but I don't add any water or anything to the whiskey. So I mean, it tastes great the way it is. You don't want to dumb it down at all. It just it to me is really good. And I just love that it tastes like Twix, in a way. That's pretty
yeah.
good candy.
It is. It's delicious. It really is. I know there are still a few places to get some bottles, and I have a talking point for you after uh, that I want to mention to you. But
Okay.
for the moment, I'm going to put a pin in our conversation because are many products that hopefully we'll talk about more in the future, from Switzerland, from Austria, from Finland. Much more to talk about and to explore. But Fred, thank you so much for coming on, taking the time talking about Eifel whiskey, about German whiskey, and explaining the mad scientist behind it. Uh, I'm really excited to have people try these whiskeys, see the reviews and tasting notes, and get their hands on them hopefully. And yeah, just thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much. It's been fun. I appreciate you
Wonderful,
having me on.
awesome. So, as you usually hear, hang on with me for a sec after distilling. Jeez, after it's been a long. It's
No more whiskey for
Wednesday.
you.
Yeah, it's Wednesday. It's been a long week. But
Yeah,
after recording, hang on with me for a sec. In
cool.
the meantime, make sure to follow Whiskey Ring Podcast, Whiskey My Wedding Ring, or Whiskey Ring, depending on the social media platform. It's a long name, had to shorten it sometimes. It happens. But when in doubt, go to the website, whiskeyMyWeddingRing.com. You can subscribe. You can find all the newest reviews. You can find social media links. There will be links to Anthem imports. There'll be links to the reviews and tasting notes in the show notes for this episode. And hopefully, as well, there will be some hints on where to find some bottles for you. So, with that, thanks so much for listening, everybody. Make sure to check out Patreon page. We're going to be starting up under the influencer again in the new year. And with that, see you next week. I was about to say see you next year. See you next week.